There's a moment that catches you off guard every time. You're sitting at a kitchen table somewhere in Louisiana or Tennessee or East Texas, and someone slides an old photograph across to you. Black and white, edges soft with age. A family portrait, maybe 80 years old. And you look at the faces, and something doesn't resolve. The cheekbones don't match the story you were told. The eyes carry something the family name never explained. You were told they were white, or you were told they were Cherokee, or you were told not to ask. For generations, the people called Redbones and Melungeons lived inside that unanswered question. Isolated communities tucked into the ridgelines of Appalachia, the piney woods of Louisiana, the borderlands where states and races and histories blurred together. They had their own surnames, their own churches, their own silence about where exactly they came from. Census takers didn't know what box to check. Courts argued about it. Soldiers were sorted by it. And the communities themselves learned, over centuries, that the safest answer was no answer at all. Now the laboratories are talking. Ancient DNA, modern genomics, population genetics refined over 30 years to the point where a cheek swab or a fragment of old bone can answer what no birth record ever would. And what the science is finding about Redbone and Melungeon ancestry is not what anyone expected. Not the romanticized version, not the sanitized version, the real one. And it is stranger, older, and more remarkable than any family myth ever captured. That's what this video is about. Let's start at the beginning. Most American mysteries have a paper trail, a ship manifest, a land deed, a court record, something that lets you follow the thread back far enough to find an answer. The Redbones and the Melungeons don't work that way. The paper trail exists, but it contradicts itself. It doubles back. It dead-ends in counties that no longer exist, in census records where the race column was crossed out and rewritten, in court documents where the same family appears as white in one decade and colored in the next and free in the one after that. Start with the names themselves. Nobody agrees on where they came from. Melungeon, the word first appears in written records in the early 1800s in the Appalachian region of what is now northeastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. The community it described was already there, already established, already surrounded by questions it wasn't answering. Theories about the word's origin range from a French term meaning mixture, to a Portuguese word, to an Afro-Portuguese Creole expression, to a term from the Turkish language meaning cursed soul. Linguists have argued about it for 100 years without resolution. Redbone is a different geography. The term appears primarily in Louisiana, East Texas, and the broader Gulf South. It described communities of similarly ambiguous ancestry, similarly tight-knit, similarly resistant to outside categorization. Some researchers treat Redbones and Melungeons as two distinct phenomena. Others see them as regional variations of the same underlying story, triracial isolate communities that formed independently but from the same raw ingredients across different parts of the American South and Appalachian borderlands. What both communities share is this: they occupied the margins, not just geographically, tucked into hollows and ridgelines and swamp edges that nobody else wanted, but socially, legally, racially. They existed in the space between the boxes that early American society tried to force everyone into. And for a very long time, that space had no name that anyone in power was willing to put on an official document. The DNA is finally giving it one. The idea that Redbones and Melungeons descended from a mixture of European, African, and Native American ancestors is not new. Researchers were proposing it as far back as the late 1800s. Folklorists wrote about it. Regional historians documented it. Genealogists tracing family lines kept arriving at the same uncomfortable intersection. Three streams, converging somewhere in the colonial period, producing communities that didn't fit the racial architecture that early America was furiously trying to construct around them. The theory was called triracial isolate. It was a clinical term, academic, deliberately neutral. It described Not just Melungeons and Redbones, but dozens of similar communities scattered across the eastern United States. The Lumbee of North Carolina, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina, the Issues of Virginia, the Wezorts of Maryland, all of them carrying the same pattern: mixed ancestry, geographic isolation, endogamy, meaning marriage within the community across generations, and a persistent, sometimes desperate resistance to being classified as Black in a society where that classification meant the systematic removal of rights. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the tri-racial thesis, obvious as it seems in retrospect, was actively resisted, not just by the communities themselves, who had powerful reasons to emphasize their Native American or European ancestry over their African ancestry, but by mainstream academic culture, which for most of the 20th century was either uninterested in these communities or actively hostile to the complexity they represented. Simple racial categories were easier. They served legal systems, census bureaus, segregation apparatus. A community that was genuinely all three things at once was an administrative problem. So the theory sat on the margins of serious scholarship for most of a century, discussed in regional journals, argued about at genealogical conferences, never quite making it into the mainstream historical narrative. And then the sequencers came online, and the argument ended. The study that changed everything was published in 2012. A team of researchers led by geneticist Roberta Estes, working alongside genealogist Jack Goins, and a consortium of citizen scientists and academic partners, collected DNA samples from individuals with documented Melungeon ancestry and ran them through full mitochondrial and Y chromosome analysis. It was not the first genetic study of these communities, but it was the most rigorous, the most comprehensive, and the most honest about what it found. The results confirmed the triracial thesis with a precision that no historian's argument ever could. The Melungeon sample showed mitochondrial haplogroups, meaning maternal lineages, drawn from three distinct continental populations: European lineages, predominantly from the British Isles and Western Europe; Sub-Saharan African lineages, consistent with ancestry from West and Central Africa; and Native American lineages, carrying the genetic signatures of indigenous North American populations. All three streams, present, measurable, and ancient, not recent mixing, not one generation of intermarriage. Ancestry that traced back centuries, in some lines to the earliest period of European contact with the Americas. The Y chromosome data, meaning the paternal lines, told a similar story with one significant addition. The European paternal lineages showed a pattern that researchers did not initially expect. Alongside the expected British and Northern European signatures, there was a detectable signal from the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, and Spain, appearing in the patrilineal ancestry of communities in the mountains of Tennessee and Virginia, faint but measurable, consistent across multiple unrelated family lines. What this means is that the founding population of these communities was not assembled in one place at one time. It was the product of a long process. Free Black families, displaced Native people, European settlers, and possibly Iberian sailors or colonists, all moving through the same borderland spaces over the same generations, finding each other in the margins and staying. The DNA doesn't call it anything. It just shows you the map. The Native American layer in Redbone and Melungeon DNA is the one that families talked about most, claimed most loudly, and paradoxically understood least accurately. For generations, the standard family story was Cherokee, always Cherokee. Across the American South and Appalachia, the claim of Cherokee ancestry became so universal that geneticists started calling it the Cherokee grandmother phenomenon. A family tradition so widespread, so consistently invoked, that it had become almost a cultural reflex rather than a specific historical memory. The DNA tells a more complicated and more interesting story. Yes, there are Native American lineages in Melungeon and Redbone genetic profiles. But the haplogroups, the specific maternal lineage markers that identify indigenous North American ancestry, do not point uniformly to Cherokee. They point to something older and more geographically specific to the southeastern coastal regions. Lineages consistent with the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Virginia and Carolina coastlands. Signatures associated with the Siwan-speaking tribes of the Carolina Piedmont. And most significantly, markers consistent with the Tuscarora. The Tuscarora connection keeps appearing. The Tuscarora were an Iroquoian-speaking people whose original homeland was in what is now eastern North Carolina. In the early 1700s, following a devastating war with English colonists and their allied tribes, the Tuscarora were displaced. Most migrated north and eventually joined the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Six Nations, in New York. But not all of them left. A significant remnant population remained in North Carolina, fragmenting, dispersing, merging into the broader landscape of free mixed-race communities that were forming along the colonial borderlands at exactly that moment. The Chavis family, one of the most prominent surnames in both Melungeon and Redbone genealogies, connects directly to this history. A Tuscarora chief named Chavis appears in colonial records. The name then spreads through the free-colored communities of North Carolina's northern border region in the 1700s, migrating west and south with the families who carried it. The Cherokee grandmother's story was never quite right. The real story reaches further east and further back. This is the layer that families didn't talk about, not in polite company, not in court, not in the census records where a wrong answer could cost you your land, your freedom, your children's future. The sub-Saharan African ancestry in Melungeon and Redbone communities was the open secret that generations of community members spent generations trying to close. And you can't blame them. You have to understand what was at stake. In the colonial American South, the legal distance between a free person of color and an enslaved person was not always as wide as it should have been. It narrowed with every decade. Every new law passed in Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, pushed free black families closer to the edge of a legal cliff. The 1806 Virginia law, demanding that freed African Americans leave the state within a year of emancipation. The freedom certificates that free people of color were required to carry at all times, or face questioning by any white citizen who chose to stop them. The systematic stripping of voting rights, property rights, testimony rights in court. In that environment, emphasizing your Native American ancestry, your European ancestry, anything that created distance between you and the category of Negro on a legal document was not dishonesty. It was survival. But the DNA does not negotiate with survival strategies. It simply reports what it finds. And what it finds in the maternal lineages of Melungeon and Redbone families are haplogroups that trace back unambiguously to West and Central Africa. Haplogroup L variations, specific to sub-Saharan African populations, appearing consistently across multiple unrelated family lines, from communities in Tennessee, Virginia, Louisiana, and East Texas. The free black families who helped found these communities, families like the Gibsons, the Goins, the Carters, were not peripheral to the story. They were architects of it. Their ancestry is written into the genome of every descendant, whether the family story acknowledged it or not. The DNA acknowledged it. The European ancestry in Melungeon and Redbone communities was always the least surprising part of the story, and the most assumed. Of course, there was European ancestry. These communities formed in colonial America, in territories settled predominantly by people from the British Isles. Scots-Irish immigrants flooding into Appalachia in the 1700s, English colonists pushing into the Carolina and Virginia backcountry, Welsh and German settlers moving through the same borderland spaces. The assumption was always that the European layer meant British, Northern European, Protestant, the standard demographic of the early American frontier. The DNA agreed with part of that. British and Northern European paternal lineages show up clearly in the Y chromosome data of Melungeon families. The Scots-Irish connection is real. The English colonial ancestry is real, But sitting alongside those expected signals is something that the standard assumption never accounted for: an Iberian signature. Portuguese and Spanish ancestry appearing in the patrilineal lines of families from the mountains of northeastern Tennessee, from communities that had no obvious reason to contain Mediterranean European genetics by any standard historical narrative. This finding sent researchers back to the historical record, looking for an explanation, and they found one, though it remains contested. The earliest European settlers in the Carolina and Virginia interior were not exclusively British. Portuguese sailors and traders had been operating along the Atlantic coast of North America from as early as the 1500s. Some researchers have proposed that shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or Portuguese colonists from failed early settlements integrated into indigenous communities along the Carolina coast generations before British colonial expansion pushed inland. Their descendants, already mixed with native populations, would then have been part of the founding stream that eventually produced the Melungeon communities of Appalachia. The theory is not universally accepted, but the Iberian signal in the DNA is not disputed. It is there, quiet, persistent, waiting in the Y chromosome of men whose families told them they were Scots-Irish for 200 years. If you want to understand how Redbone and Melungeon communities were actually built, stop looking at the categories and start looking at the surnames, because the surnames are where the story becomes concrete, where the abstraction of tri-racial ancestry becomes specific families, specific people, specific decisions made across specific generations that produce the communities we can still trace today. Certain names appear everywhere. You find them in the Melungeon communities of Newman's Ridge in Tennessee. You find them in the Redbone settlements of Sabine Parish in Louisiana. You find them among the free colored families of Hertford County in North Carolina. You find them in the mixed-race communities of the Virginia Piedmont. The same names, moving west and south across 2 centuries, staying together, marrying each other, carrying their tangled ancestry with them like luggage that never quite unpacked. Chavis, Gowan, Gibson, Carter. These are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of a specific social network that formed in the colonial borderlands and held together across geography and generations. Researchers tracing these families find the same pattern repeatedly. A free black patriarch or matriarch in the colonial Carolinas, connected by marriage or kinship to native families from the coastal tribes, connected again to European settlers on the frontier margins. Their children marry within the same extended network. Their grandchildren do the same. By the 3rd and 4th generation, the community is both internally diverse and externally cohesive. They recognize each other by name before they know each other's faces. The Gibson family alone appears in Melungeon records in Tennessee, Redbone records in Louisiana, and free-colored records in at least 4 other states, often in the same generation. Genealogists who have traced the lines carefully believe many of these Gibson families share a common origin point somewhere in the Carolina borderlands in the early to mid-1700s. The families didn't just share ancestry, they shared a strategy. Stay together. The genome preserved it. The surnames announced it. Henry Chavis went to war for a country that had not decided what he was. He enlisted in the Continental Army, served in the North Carolina state line, fought in a revolution built on the language of universal liberty. And when it was over, he went home to Hertford County and lived on 150 acres with his wife Peggy. When he died, Peggy had to go before a court to collect 1 year of back pay owed to her husband for his service. She could not do it alone. She brought a white veteran named William Manley to stand beside her and confirm that yes, Henry Chavis had done what she said he had done, and yes, this widow deserved what was owed to her. That moment, a woman who had already lost her husband, standing in a courthouse needing a white witness to make her word count, is the whole story of what free people of color faced in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War compressed into a single scene. The estimates of black and mixed-race soldiers who served in the Revolution have been revised sharply upward in recent scholarship. Figures now suggest somewhere near 10,000, more than double earlier historical estimates. In North Carolina alone, Over 250 free men of color served after the General Assembly mandated military service for all men ages 16 to 50, regardless of race, in May of 1777. The detail lists from that period describe these soldiers in terms that reveal the full complexity of who they actually were. Negro, mulatto, mustee, yellow, Indian man, mixed descent. The census of a borderland community written in military ink. A century and a half later, the same communities faced the same wall from a different direction. When Melungeon men from Hancock County, Tennessee were conscripted in World War I, draft boards took one look at their complexions and assigned them to black regiments. The men resisted. Legal action was required to keep them where they were placed. They didn't fit the white regiment's threshold. They were placed in the black regiment by default. They didn't fully belong there either. 2 wars, 2 centuries apart, the same impossible position. Before we get to the final part of this story, one thing. Everything I've just shown you about Redbone and Melungeon ancestry is traceable inside your own DNA results. Over at the Origin DNA, I built a 3-volume PDF guide bundle that teaches you how to unlock your raw data, find relatives, and uncover those deeper origin stories. Link is below. Now, here's what nobody talks about. When a community marries inside itself for long enough, the genome starts to show it, not immediately, not in the first generation of endogamy, or the second, or even the third, but over time, across enough generations of cousins marrying cousins and neighbors marrying neighbors inside a closed social world, the genetic diversity of that community begins to compress. Rare variants become common. Common variants spread until they are nearly universal. The range of genetic difference that exists in an open, outbreeding population gradually narrows into something measurably tighter. This is what researchers find when they look at the genomics of long-established Melungeon and Redbone communities. A bottleneck signature. The same kind of compression visible in the DNA of any population that spent significant time in geographic or social isolation. It is not as severe as what ancient DNA reveals in some pre-contact Native American populations after European disease swept through. But it is there, measurable, datable to roughly the period when these communities were most tightly sealed off from the surrounding society. The late 1700s through the mid-1800s, when legal pressure was highest, when passing as something else was most necessary, when the borderland hollows and piney wood settlements were most fully turned inward on themselves. The medical implications are real. Certain genetic variants associated with specific health risks appear at elevated frequencies in these populations compared to the broader American average. Researchers studying Appalachian health disparities have begun looking at founder effect and endogamy as contributing factors to patterns of disease that were previously explained entirely by poverty or access to healthcare. But the bottleneck tells another story alongside the medical one. It tells you how completely these communities were sealed off, how thoroughly the outside world's hostility drove them inward. The genome is not just a record of ancestry. It is a record of pressure, of what it costs, biologically, to survive in a society that cannot decide what you are and makes you pay for the ambiguity. The isolation that protected them also marked them. Both things are true. The DNA holds both without contradiction. The Melungeon community of Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee never disappeared. It bent, it compressed. It lost people to migration, to assimilation, to the long grinding pressure of a society that rewarded the erasure of complexity, but it did not disappear. And in the last 30 years, something has shifted. The silence that protected these communities for 2 centuries has started to give way to something that looks, cautiously, like reclamation. The Melungeon Heritage Association was founded in 1997. It holds annual gatherings in Sneedville, Tennessee, in the heart of the original Newman's Ridge community. People come from across the country. Descendants of the Gibson families, the Chavis lines, the Goins, and the Carters. People who grew up being told one story about where they came from and who have spent their adult lives finding out the story was more complicated and more interesting than the one they inherited. The DNA has become part of that reclamation. For many descendants, the genetic confirmation of triracial ancestry is not a revelation so much as a vindication. The science, saying out loud what the family always suspected but could never quite prove. The sub-Saharan African lineages that grandparents deflected questions about. The Native American haplogroups that the Cherokee grandmother story was always reaching for, imprecisely in the direction of something real. The Iberian signal that nobody had a story for at all. For others, the DNA raises questions that reclamation hasn't fully answered. What does it mean to claim Melungeon or Redbone identity today? Is it a racial identity? An ethnic identity? A regional one? If your great-great-grandmother's mitochondrial DNA traces to West Africa and your great-great-grandfather's Y chromosome traces to Portugal and the Native American lineage in the middle came from a Tuscarora community that itself was displaced and dispersed, what box do you check? The honest answer, the one the DNA actually supports, is that the box was always the wrong unit of measurement. These communities were never one thing. They were a strategy, a survival structure, a chosen people assembled from the margins of every category that colonial America tried to impose. They are still here. The genome says so. There is a photograph somewhere in almost every family that carries this history, tucked into a shoebox, folded inside a Bible, scanned and uploaded to an Ancestry website with a question mark in the caption. A face that doesn't resolve into the story the family told. A grandmother whose cheekbones nobody could explain. A great-uncle whose complexion prompted silence at reunions. The science that can now read that silence is not magic. It is 30 years of refined technology applied to fragments of bone and cheek swabs, and the careful patience of researchers willing to follow the data wherever it leads. And where it leads, in the case of the Redbones and the Melungeons, is somewhere extraordinary. Not tragic, though tragedy is part of the story. Not simple, though simplicity was always what the census taker wanted. But extraordinary. A 300-year-old survival structure built from the pieces of 3 continents, held together by shared surnames and geographic isolation, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to be erased by a society that kept trying. The Chavis families, and the Gibson families, and the Goins are still here. The communities are still here. The language of reclamation is getting louder, and the DNA is finally giving that reclamation something that no court document and no census record ever offered. Evidence. Specific, measurable, undeniable evidence of exactly who these people were and where they came from and how long they have been holding on. Write a number in the comments, 1 through 3. 1 if the Iberian signal in the paternal lines surprised you most. 2 if it was the Tuscarora connection. 3 if it was the bottleneck, what isolation actually cost these communities biologically. Just a number. I read every one. And if you know someone still holding a photograph with a question mark in the caption, send them this.
Thanks for watching. Before you head out, don't let your DNA profile just sit there collecting digital dust. Tap the link in the description to download your ebook and finally make sense of it all tonight.